Welcome back, finally, to a new season of Presidents in Politics. I am one of your hosts, Professor Caleb McGee, joined by my fellow co-host, former Congressman Ross. It's been a long time.
It's been a long summer.
Yes,
Good
it
one.
has. It was a good one, but I think we're ready to get back to this. And I think this is a good individual to start back with. Herbert Hoover.
I was fascinated by him when we started doing our research on this. I did not, he caught a lot of flack because he just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time as president when the Depression hit. But his background is absolutely stunning.
Yes, 31st president. And we talk about this a lot, that some presidents end up in unfortunate circumstances of when they were president, right?
Yeah.
Which with him, it's going to be the Great Depression, of course. If you think about George W. Bush and the falling of the Twin Towers,
True.
Sometimes you just end up in circumstances that feel like a no-win scenario. And I think Herbert Hoover, in many ways, is kind of the quintessential president who was in a bad situation. And then in many ways, I would say, we were talking this before we began, he is the target of political spin.
Oh, gosh, yes. And let's go back to, he's born in Iowa to a Quaker parents. His father passes away when he's 6. Mm-hmm. His mother passes away when he's 9. Mm-hmm. So he's orphaned. He and his 2 siblings are orphaned. Mm-hmm. He goes to live with an uncle in Oregon and just knows nothing but hard work.
That's right.
And that's what establishes his ethic. He's prone to be a Quaker and follow the Quaker principles and is very self-assured, goes to Stanford, the first graduating class, gets a degree in geology, and starts a mining company.
Well, can we go back for a minute to talk about his Quaker roots? I remember reading about this because most Quakers are pacifist.
Yes.
And Hoover wasn't, obviously. You see his desire to go to war at times, but he's moderate in his idea of war. He's not a hawk and he's not a dove, right?
Correct.
He's not pushing for war, but he's not going to let other countries walk over him as well. And as I was reading one of his biographies, his uncle, who raised him for a few years, was a diehard Quaker, but they called him I'm trying to remember the term they used, but basically like a belligerent pacifist, which was interesting. And basically, the uncle used to paraphrase the Bible, and he would say, turn the other cheek if someone strikes you once, and then hit them back. and I kind of think that was Hoover's foreign policy. I think you'd agree with me on that.
I agree.
That was his foreign policy, is if they hit us once, turn the other cheek, and then you hit them back after that.
Yeah.
It's an interesting foreign policy.
Because he had a very humanitarian nature.
Yes, he did. And that's a Quaker heart, I think.
Yes, and that really established his career after he made his money as a multimillionaire as an engineer. And then he and his wife go to China.
During the Boxer Rebellion. And spends his time, his wife becomes a nurse, treating for the people there. He works on food and humanitarian aid. And that establishes, I think, his calling in life. Yes. Yeah, and I got to back up again because his life is just so... I feel like they should make a movie about him. His life is so interesting.
I agree with you.
That when he goes to Stanford, like you said, it's the first graduating class. His first semester is free tuition because it's basically trying to entice people to come. So he goes, his first semester is free. He has to work his way through the rest of college, gets his bachelor's in geology. And then when he tries to go get a job, he basically shows his diploma. And he was speaking... I remember watching... There's a really interesting interview you can watch of him in 1960s, 84, still sharp as a tack. It's an amazing interview. And he said that basically when he walked around trying to get a job, he would hold up his diploma and be like, well, what even is Stanford? We don't want to give you a job out for that. So he starts out of college first working in the mines, making $2.50 a day. And he said he actually had to work up to actually getting to operate the drill. At first, he just loaded boxes. Gosh. And he does this for several months. And then because of his degree and his connections back at Stanford, they help him get this job as a mining engineer. And he goes to Australia.
Yeah.
And he becomes a millionaire in his 20s.
Yes.
So he goes from making $2.50 a day to being a millionaire, goes back to the States, marries his wife, who also had a degree in geology, first female to graduate from Stanford with a geology degree. Yeah. And then they go to China together, and now that he's a millionaire, he's married. I mean, life changed rapidly for him.
Yeah, at an early age.
At a very early age. He's in his 30s now in China, married with kids. I think they said that during his first several years of marriage, he went around the world 7 times, something of that nature.
Gosh.
He's all over the place. He's globetrotting. And when he's in China, the Boxer Rebellion breaks out. I think he said in his autobiography he spent a month under fire until they finally sent the Marines in to get the Americans out. And maybe this is one of the experiences that so burdened him for this idea of humanitarian aid, specifically at times of war.
Right. And that's where I think, he in World War I was called on by Woodrow Wilson. Mm-hmm. Well, yes, to help alleviate the hunger
in
starvation in Belgium.
And he starts out of his own pocket at first. The American government doesn't want to get involved at first.
Not at all.
And he's a millionaire. So he's basically like, fine, we'll go finance the thing.
And he does. 120,000 lives, apparently, they say he saved by doing this.
Yes.
And then they put him as head of the, the Food Administration for the United States.
And then Commerce, which is, he does some really interesting stuff when he's head of Commerce.
But, Harding appoints him to Commerce. Coolidge keeps him there at Commerce. He transcended both parties.
Oh, yeah.
He was he supported the League of Nations.
Yes.
Which was his party didn't care for.
No.
They thought he was a progressive in the Republican Party.
Because he supported Teddy Roosevelt.
Yes.
It's the first time he ever contributed to a campaign is when he contributed to Teddy Roosevelt's campaign.
Yeah.
So, but there's some serious.
I guess he was a rhino back then. He might have been the first one.
Was that the very first of the day?
Yeah.
He is such a fascinating guy. When he was the head of Commerce, actually, he did some really interesting things. He was all about efficiency, and a lot of times people would say he was very curt in his mannerisms because he was business, he was efficient. And one of the things he did is he actually helped to streamline the milk dairy industry, but specifically the milk distribution industry. When he came to the director of commerce, they had 40 different types of bottles and measurements for buying milk, and he was actually one who said, "Okay, we got to streamline this. Let's have the pint, the quart, the half gallon, the gallon, and that's all we're going to sell milk in."
Wow!
And it streamlined the dairy industry, and they actually began making a lot of money. They were starting to go in the red. They actually came in the black. The other thing he did that was very interesting is he was the first to standardize traffic lights. Up until this point, different cities and states may have different colors to mean different things, and he was the first. Okay, we're all going to have green to go and red to stop. There was no yellow yet because cars didn't move fast enough to really need a yellow. So he's the very first one to begin standardizing a lot of these. He was an efficient mind, but he's an engineer, right?
Yes.
You ever hang out with engineers?
Oh, yeah, just when I'm trying to get a nap or something.
They're different than we are. I've been in some meetings like with more STEM mindsets, right? And like engineers, physics professors, and these are the guys like in the corner staring at their shoes.
Yeah.
But dang it, they're not brilliant. But they're not going to talk to you.
No. They're very good at what they do.
They're good at what they do. And I think those of us sometimes with more maybe humanities minds, we don't always understand them. They don't always understand us, but they don't communicate the same way. And I think sometimes with Hoover, he was an engineer.
He was an engineer, and he was a logistics guy.
Yeah.
And I think that's why he was so successful, with his food administration, and then during World War I in the United States, he creates the meatless days and the wheatless days,
right.
and it's all volunteer.
Yes.
But the American people subscribe to it. They go, but we'll do our part.
Yes.
We won't have meat this day. We won't use wheat this day. That way we'll save and help with those that need it most.
I love where you're going with this because I think there are many vast differences between Hoover and Roosevelt, his predecessor. But I think the major one is Hoover wanted to inspire the individual to make the choice themselves. Yep. Roosevelt wanted to impose the choice by government regulation. And if you stop and think about that, I believe if you can inspire an individual to do something because you tell them it's the greater good, the entire what's the word we look for? The entire ethics behind the nation feels different.
The momentum changes.
Think about it this way. Think about War II when Pearl Harbor's bombed and Uncle Sam needs you, and just the outpour of men who register to fight, and then think of Vietnam where they're told they have to fight.
Yep.
There's something about being inspired to do something versus being told you have to do something. And for the American spirit, the American spirit is founded upon rebellion. I mean, no matter how you want to cut it, we were founded upon rebellion.
Yes, we were.
And I think if you look at being told to do something versus being inspired to do something, it's vastly different. What are your thoughts on this with Hoover? He wanted to always inspire someone to do that.
And he did it very well.
Yes.
Until he became president and inherited the Great Depression.
Oh, my goodness.
Here was a guy who just he came in. He had the largest majority of the Electoral College, I think, ever, 444 to
87.
Yeah, I mean, this guy's coming in on a crest,
a landslide.
He's and I think in his inauguration, I have. He says, I have no fears for the future of our country. It is bright with hope. 9 months later, in October. The Great Depression hits, and he incidentally creates his own New Deal.
That's right.
He realizes government has to do something, and he goes out there and he starts the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to try to loan money. He cuts taxes to try to keep more money in the economy.
Imagine that.
Yes, but unfortunately he didn't. He also had the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which probably was the Achilles heel of his administration because it raised tariffs on imports, and therefore Americans couldn't afford to buy them, and
inflation.
The foreign companies decided they weren't going to even sell to us, and so you just had the bottom drop out.
And he also kind of begins the idea of public works, which FDR takes. That's all FDR's credit. Like, we did this. The Hoover Dam, does that mean anything?
Yeah.
I mean, he kind of begins the idea of public works. And again, I like it because it's not forcing something down someone's throat. It's saying the government will pay you a good salary if you'll come and do a job for us. It's an interesting thought process.
I saw where this is a quote from Roosevelt running against him in 1932. He said that he was engaging in reckless and extravagant spending, and ran on a Democratic platform calling for an immediate and drastic reduction of government expenditures by at least 25%.
Wow,
that blows the mind. So, you fast forward to today's presidential campaign. Really? You got to make up your own mind based on your own research, because they're going to say whatever they want. And when you look back, and I think this was fascinating about Hoover, is that he realized the government had a responsibility to get involved as much as it was against his principles. What he wasn't for was direct funding to the individual.
That's right.
And as you fast forward to today, we go through COVID, we go through 9/11. We are paying people, and I have to find that somewhere. But he was against what he said was having people live off the American dole. You know, and I get that, and I wonder if we would have survived under Hoover if he had won in 32. But a lot of what happened, and we'll get into this under Roosevelt, of course, was when World War II hit, that created this industrialization in America that we had never seen before, and that spurned our economy, and then that things changed thereafter. But he got the rap for a bad economy, that it wasn't his fault. He inherited it and probably didn't do as much as he could have to save it.
But it's his principles that's preventing him.
It's his principles, and the shanty towns that were going up, and I think this is where it goes back to what you were talking about, the momentum, is you got all these shanty towns because you're 25% unemployment. People are living, in squandered villages that they create, and they call them Hoovervilles.
Yeah.
And that doesn't bode well when you're running for re-election.
No, and the political machine jumps on this. But I want to go to what you're saying, because I agree with you. He wanted to see aid given, but he did not believe the federal government was the sole purpose of giving aid. He actually still wanted to work through charities, through individuals.
Yeah, he believed in the charities and then individuals, and state and local governments.
And then state and local. He believed that the federal hand was kind of the guiding hand of these things. However, and you think about this, there's a lot of individuals that say, well, that doesn't work, there's corruption in that. Well, you're right, because the federal government never has corruption.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But you do have to wonder, if you look back historically at local charities, local churches, local nonprofits providing aid, they are much more efficient for multiple reasons. They're faster moving on the ground. They know the local community better. They don't have much overhead at all. Think about, and you know this so much better than any of us working in Congress, for every dollar that's set aside tax money to help an individual, how much of that dollar actually sees the individual? It doesn't have to go through offices and overhead and offices. And before long, it's cents on the dollar. It's actually going to the individual.
Absolutely.
Versus churches, nonprofits, private individuals, private charities. If you look at the efficiency rate, it is vastly superior from a private sector. However, then the question is always the regulation versus corruption, and I do understand that. But it raises some interesting questions, and we know where Hoover stood on this.
Oh yeah, and he was very strong. He wanted to help, but he didn't want to further any opportunity for more corruption in the chain of federal dollars being appropriated. Interesting guy. I didn't realize, how much of a humanitarian he was, and how much he really believed that government, like you said, he started the government work programs.
Yes.
The Hoover Dam, which, by the way, he was not even invited to the opening.
That's right.
That's
right.
But he was a brilliant man, and he was used by other administrations. He was used by Truman. Truman enlisted him. Eisenhower enlisted him. He transcended partisan politics, and I like that about the guy, because he was so principled.
Yes, his faith came first.
Yes.
And his principles came first over politics. Imagine that.
Yeah.
But I remember reading, like you said, when he was later active presidency, when he was recommissioned to go back over and start helping with Russia during some of their food crises. I was listening to this interview of him, and he's like 84 when he's giving this interview, and they start asking some of the dicey situations he was in. And he said, yeah, when I was in Russia, it wasn't that big of a deal, but basically I was in this residency, and I was looking out the window, and some of the riots began to break out, and they actually had an explosion go off in the street, and it blew glass all through the window, like cut him all up, and he's like, but it wasn't that big of a deal.
Isn't that amazing?
I mean,
he caught grief for the humanitarian aid he was providing in Russia because he was accused of helping the Bolsheviks.
That's right.
And I think he said something to the effect, there are millions of people starving over there. I don't care what political party they are.
Right. He did.
They're humans. And
because there were those on other sides that said basically if we starve them out, they're going to have to surrender. First of all, historically it doesn't really work at all. And secondly, one of the things he said, I'm reading again through some of his autobiography, and he's like that lays such a level of resentment in the people's hearts that will take generations to get it out. Did we not see that with World War I in Germany and the amount of reparations that were demanded of Germany? So much so that hyperinflation kicks in, and then what happens? They're ripe for the Nazi Party. Now Hitler steps up and he's like, the West has been, killing us, destroying us.
It's time we take back our country.
Yes.
All in the name of nationalism.
I think we brought this up before, but Colonel Tim Collins, he was a colonel over the North Irish Army during Afghanistan and Iraq. And he has this really famous speech that he gave. Bush actually had it hanging in his office. It's just amazing. It's well written. But part of the speech, he makes the statement, if you are ferocious in battle, you must be magnanimous in victory. And I really like that. And I think for Hoover, that's kind of his Quaker mindset. That's the belligerent pacifist, if you will. We're going to come back in and we'll bring law and order. We're going to bring justice, but we're going to try to do it in a gracious way. Yeah,
he was against, when World War II was being begun, and before Pearl Harbor, he was against any U.S. intervention in it, and it wasn't until the Pearl Harbor that he agreed. Because you're right, he was as much of a pacifist as a president could be.
Right,
more so, I think, than Woodrow Wilson was.
I agree.
In World War I, but it was also interesting. He's the one who signed into law the Star Spangled Banner being the national anthem. I thought that was pretty cool.
That's right. Yes.
He was a patriot.
He was a patriot. In fact, later in life, he's a much older man during the Cold War. He even talks about the struggle between the God-fearing country of America and the agnostic communist. And for him, this is almost like a divine mission, which so many individuals during the Cold War made this divine mandate, if you will, on both sides. And he really was a large part of that. He really believed that this was an apocalyptic, if you will, war between the people of God and the agnostics or the communists or the atheists, the evil empire, which Reagan plays right into, right? When Reagan comes to power, he kind of uses the same language, if you will, that had been built up by that base. It's interesting though.
Yeah, it is. Well, seeing how his whole life was just a great success story.
And coming from such hardship.
Yes, and here he lives the American dream, becomes president of the United States, and then the Great Depression. And I think that's where, the poor guy was at the wrong place at the wrong time for his legacy, because it's taken a while for people to realize that Hoover was a very good person, a very good president. He could have done some things differently, I think, like all presidents could have.
Like all of us.
Yes, but I think you're right. There should be a movie made of him.
I agree.
Because I think there's a lot that can be learned. Just the determination, just the work ethic, just the patriotism, just the belief in the divine intervention that we can endure by the grace of God.
I really like where you're going with this. And I think one of the things that he teaches us is resiliency.
Yeah.
And I think his faith is foundational. And I thought a lot about that this week as I was just kind of thinking and reflecting on his life. This society, this time period, was a society that was based on resiliency. Something bad happened to you. You overcame it. You became greater. I think we're building a mentality of victimhood in our current culture. If something bad has happened to you, then basically you need to let that define you.
Yeah.
And I don't see that in the life of Hoover. He's orphaned at the age of 9. He has a very hard upbringing. He has so many political problems. He's under fire multiple times. All that he went through in his life, but he never allows himself to fall into the trap of victimhood.
Exactly. Woe is me.
Yes.
Somebody come help me. No, he was able to pull his own self up. He was able, and again, I think his faith sustained him.
His faith is what allowed it to happen.
And that's so much to be learned from that.
Yes.
Again, which is why they should make a movie.
I agree, and I think just for our listeners, because you and I have said this so many times, that these podcasts, we're doing them for a reason, because I believe we learn from history.
Absolutely.
And I believe as we're hopefully, as we teach future, hopefully, politicians. Who knows if we're going to have the next president in 20 years in one of our classes, right?
Right.
And one of the things I always want to instill in my students, first of all, of course, are those principles of faith. But also one of the things we want to instill in our students is this idea of resiliency. You've had bad things happen to you in life, and that's going to mark. You're going to carry those with you. It's not that you just ignore the emotion. It's not that you rub some dirt on it and walk on. My granddad used to have a saying, jump up off the ground for the pain jumps on you. Ha! Sometimes I didn't jump off the ground fast enough because I still felt the pain. But it's not that mentality. Those emotions are there. They're real. But don't allow them to trap you in the mindset of victimhood. Allow them to build resiliency in your life and then move on and accomplish greatness. We see that in the life of Hoover, right?
Yeah, you do.
Hoover was that guy.
And he could have easily folded his tent when he lost overwhelmingly to Roosevelt.
Yes.
He could have said, you know what? I gave it my all. They didn't listen to me. I'm moving on. No. He said, I am committed to the greater good.
That's right.
I am here for you, Franklin Roosevelt, even though I don't agree with your policies. I'm here for you, Harry Truman, who used him, Dwight Eisenhower, who used him. And he continued writing up until he died at 90 years old.
That's right.
In the early 60s.
And I love this because how he was an avid fisherman, avid fisherman. How easy it would have been to just be like, I'm going to retire and I'm just going to fish out every day and not deal with the pressure of politics anymore. But he doesn't do that. And we talked this a lot, actually, in my political philosophy class this morning, the idea of purpose. And I think that the more driven, the more idea of purpose you have in your life, the longer, the more longevity you have in your career, right?
Yeah.
And I think once you lose that sense of purpose, then it's downhill from there.
And I think that purpose is that hope. Absolutely. That hope brings us through.
And again, he's grounded in his faith. He
Yes.
is an unapologetic follower of Jesus Christ.
Amen.
And that changes the way he looks at things. Yep. One of the big things we have to talk about, we talk humanitarian aid, one of the big events that catapulted him to the presidency was the Great Mississippi Flood of 1928.
Yeah.
So in 1928, the Mississippi banks overflow, and I wrote this down. It was something like 1.5 million people were displaced from their home. It's one of the greatest natural disasters in American history. He steps in with this great engineering logistical mind. He starts setting up these camps, bringing in food and aid. Here was the number that he boasted. At the end of this, 1.5 million people are displaced, 3 deaths.
That's amazing.
Can you imagine if FEMA could do that today?
That is amazing.
1.5 million people displaced on the banks of the Mississippi, 3 deaths. And here's also what he bragged. It didn't cost the government a dime because he went around with his private industries paying for everything. The only thing that the U.S. government paid for was the Navy and the Coast Guard securing the borders, working some logistics. Everything else was funded by private charities.
We need to learn from him.
Okay.
It can happen.
Look at something, again, not to be political at all, just look at something like Katrina.
Yeah. Oh.
How much money was funded by the government? How much was corruption handed over to other entities? And how many deaths and horrible things took place versus this? So something now you could say, well, culture and society has gotten worse. Maybe you can argue that, but also look at the logistics of the way these situations were handled.
Yes, that's true. Too much government. Maybe too much money too.
Maybe so. Maybe that's
maybe that breeds the corruption.
Maybe that's a reality, and I think also maybe lack of accountability. That as you keep getting away with something, you think you can get away with more. Yeah. I was teaching my American Survey class this last week. We were walking through the Civil War again, and we were talking about some of the government corruption that took place on both sides, but specifically at times the union of individuals who'd profit off of the war. There's a very, very famous general. His first name was Justice. His last name was McKenzie, something of that nature, and he was a purchasing officer, one of the head purchasing officers for the Union. And he started stealing and pulling back supplies from the Union. One of his last contracts he got caught on was he signed a contract for 1,000 horses for the Union cavalry. You know how many he delivered? 2. He kept 998 and sold them.
Oh, my.
It's amazing how blinding this corruption becomes. And you wonder, as you haven't seen the government kind of grow, if that's...
Yeah.
So I think there is a lot that could be learned from Hoover and maybe his mentality of how humanitarian aid is rendered.
And hence you have the Hoover Institute at Stanford University.
Which is amazing. There's some amazing documentation. I haven't actually been there, but I've read through some of their online.
Condoleezza Rice is head of it. Yep.
What an incredibly bright mind, by the way.
Yeah.
She's one of the brightest minds I think in politics right now, honestly. And her and George W. Bush's friendship, if you ever read through, they had one of the coolest friendships. But that's we'll get to that in the coming presidents. I got to read you this quote though that he said, and I really, really like this. Here's what he said: "Wisdom consists not so much in knowing what to do in the ultimate, as knowing what to do next."
Wow.
which that's an engineer's mind.
That is.
But I like that. We get so hung up on the meta-narrative sometimes, on what the end goal is, that we just don't do what the next right step is, right?
You're right.
Like, sometimes, my granddad was an old Navy man, and he made the statement, sometimes you can't steer a ship that's not moving. And you think about that, like when a boat's floating, you have power behind it.
You've got some good country wisdom behind you. You know that?
Cowboy philosophy? Is that its own genre? I should write a book, maybe, Cowboy I don't know. But if you stop and think about that, sometimes you just got to start moving and then just do the right next step, the right next step, the right next step. And for our government and for our parties right now, maybe we constantly ask the question, how do we fix it? How do we fix it? Let's just start making some right steps.
I agree.
In the right direction.
We could learn from him.
And see what takes place. Also, I thought this was interesting, if you read this or not, his vice president was a guy by the last name of Curtis, and he was 1/4 Native American. He was Kaw Indian, and he actually grew up part of his life on a reservation.
I did not know that.
But Hoover, during some of his boyhood, would actually hunt with Indian children. So he was not racist towards Native Americans in a time period when most people were. So he picks a vice president who's actually 1/4 Native American. I thought this was just super cool.
Diversity before diversity was cool.
Yeah, it shows the heart of Hoover. I mean, again, it's faith. Faith allows you to look past ridiculous political ideas.
Well put.
And
he was probably the right person at the right time to be where he was.
I think
what happened with the Depression.
I think about, we love Teddy Roosevelt, one of our favorite podcasts we did. But can you imagine if Teddy Roosevelt was president in this time? What would have happened? He was not the right man for the right time.
No, you're right.
And you and I have made this statement before, but as a believer, as a follower of Jesus Christ, one of the things I see over and over again is I just see God's providential hand. You just see God put. What does the Bible say? He sets up kings and he takes down kings. He's just putting in the right guy at the right time.
You're right.
The right guy at the right time.
And sometimes we get what we deserve.
Don't we see that with Saul in the Old Testament?
Yes.
The people want the king. The people want the king. This is the kind of king they want.
Yep.
Fine, have it. Again, I'm going to go back to my country roots here. There's an old country song called "I Thank God for Unanswered Prayers."
Oh yeah, yeah.
Sometimes,
Garth Brooks.
Yeah, that was Garth Brooks, wasn't it? Sometimes I thank God for it. I think about my early life, right? You can think about some of the jobs you wanted, some of the things you wanted.
Things I didn't get that I thought I deserved. Thank God I didn't get them.
And then you look back there like, oh, Lord, thank you for that. And I think sometimes maybe we're reaching the point where God's just finally like, you want it?
Yeah, okay.
And you're going to be like, but I really don't, with some wisdom and some maturity. As you said, 1932, he loses his second term to FDR, and then FDR kind of pins the entire Depression on Hoover. Hoover, by the way, is the first to coin the term Depression. Yeah. Up until this point, as you well know, because you're a history guy too, they're called panics. Yeah. Everything's a panic. The Panic of 1837, the Panic of this. And Hoover thought that Depression was a more palatable term, and then ironically, it gets pinned on him, and he becomes known as the Depression guy. He spends
the rest of his life defending himself on it. Yeah.
Later in life, he kind of had a good sense of humor about it. He'd say he was the only man alive that the Depression named after him. He kind of made a humorous attempt at handling this. But yeah, he had a rough go. He had a brilliant mind, him and his wife. I was reading through his autobiography, and they actually find this old mining text that was 400 years old. It was written in Latin, and was called something along the lines of something Metallica, which is Latin, not the band, but Latin for metal or metallurgy mining. And him and his wife actually translate this book from Latin to English, and it's still used in some mining circles. So one of the reasons why is because she had a brilliant mind for Latin, and he knew mining very well from his experience. So they translate this book together, and it was just like a labor of love, something they wanted to do.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So you see his mind, and you and I say this all the time, but one of the things we see with these early presidents is they had such keen brains, and we're not producing a generation of keen brains.
No, we're not. I'm afraid we're developing victims. I'm afraid we're developing entitlements. I think that's where we have to really focus on the work ethic, how we, earning things. But we do it as a community. We just don't. Anyway.
Yeah. One of the quotes, I went back this week and I watched again his interview from 1960, which was just, it was really fun. It was kind of a labor of love, just sitting and watching his interview, watching this guy in his 80s, just seeing what a patriot he was, seeing what a heart he had for America, his faith. And I'll never forget I wrote this down as I was sitting there watching it. One of the things he said, he talked about traveling around the world 7 times, and then he said this, speaking of America, this is the place where freedom really lives.
Wow.
I like that.
So do I. And if anybody knows, he would know.
He would know. He'd been through the Box Rebellion. He had seen some of the Bolshevik Rebellion. All the things he had seen.
Yep.
And then he looked around after traveling the world, and he said, here in America, this is the place where freedom really lives. So the truth of the matter is we have the freest form of government. It keeps getting handed down. Now it's our job to vote, to build political institutions in such a way that we protect that freedom.
To preserve that freedom. Yes, sir. Well put.
And we don't allow it to denigrate, which can happen so easily. I got to tell you this, too. As I was reading his autobiography, he was such a man of principle and of faith. It's a Quaker. He had read through the entire Bible by the age of 10.
Whoa.
That's what shaped him, in my opinion.
Wow.
That's the reason why he was a humanitarian. That's the reason why he had the mind. That's the reason why he cared about people. Yeah. That's the reason why he would hire an indigenous person to be his vice president when no one else would. That's the reason why he saw life a little differently.
Yeah.
It's because of his faith.
Yeah, the sanctity of life.
In the image of God, right? All the way back to Genesis,
Yes.
that we are created male and female. We are created in the image of God, the Imago Dei. We are image bearers of God. And as you look at this, I believe you see where Hoover lived and modeled his life and his political career after that.
Well put.
So, just what a great guy. One of his final things he said as a Quaker is that the Word of God, more than anything else, produces the idea of individual faithfulness, individual responsibility.
Yep.
What happened to that?
Yeah, I wish we could legislate it, but we can't.
Right? And isn't that all? And you and I had this conversation so many times, but that's always the answer. Make a new law.
Absolutely,
Make
it is.
a new law.
Exercise personal responsibility. Don't rely on government to save you from your own negligence or.
I remember an old military officer, I can't remember his name right now, but reading one of his biographies, and he made the statement, discipline yourself so others don't have to.
Yeah.
And that's really good.
That's powerful.
Yeah, like if we as Americans lived that way, if we had individual responsibility, self-discipline, self-motivation, you wouldn't need half of Congress.
No, you wouldn't. And you wouldn't need all those administrative agencies.
The bureaucracy.
Oh, my gosh.
Yes. So maybe the answer, we were talking this in political philosophy today, maybe the answer is to rebuild from the ground up.
Amen.
It really is. To rebuild this idea of, like you said, of community, of individual responsibility, of individual freedom, of individual faithfulness. We talk a lot about freedom and rights, but we don't talk a whole lot about responsibility and faithfulness.
Yep, you're absolutely right.
So Herbert Hoover.
Great guy.
Good guy. Horrible reputation that he has earned, and I really believe it was an unfit reputation.
I do too.
I think we need to reclaim Herbert Hoover.
I agree.
Herbert Hoover for 28.
Yes.
This has been Presidents in Politics talking about the mislabeled and yet great Herbert Hoover.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.